There you are. You are here about the job. Janitor's assistant. You need to go to the interview. Go that way to the elevator.
Thanks.
Control, the latest game from the folks at Remedy, a studio you may or may not recognize. Remedy is not a developer that is constantly in the media, which might actually be a compliment these days. But you probably know them by reputation. Think Quantum Break, most recently, Alan Wake, a while back, and the Max Payne series if you want to go all the way back to my childhood. So from that portfolio alone, you can deduce two things about this game. Number one, it's a third-person shooter. And number two, the core gameplay will be good. Full stop. So when this game was announced, there was one concern I had seeing the trailers, but now after playing it, I can confidently confirm this is not a horror game, I promise. The setting is definitely weird, sometimes really weird, but I never felt like the intention was to scare me. Another thing this game is not is cover-based, much like Quantum Break was. And early on, this catches you off guard a bit. Enemies tend to be aggressive with their fire and tactics, but you quickly realize that the game also rewards mobility and aggression from you as well. Now, if you just came to this video to find out if the game is worth a buy, you now know what to expect, and yes, it is good. You have my blessing. Would you kindly remember to like and subscribe if you found this helpful before you move on to the next video? Thanks.
Are they gone? Right, gentlemen. We need to trace every device that has downloaded a copy of this game and scramble the storage. And somebody find out how these guys got a hold of classified SCP files now.
Okay, seriously though. The SCP was the first thing I thought of when I played this game. Almost as though it's paying homage to the Foundation itself. If you don't know, the SCP Foundation is a fictitious organization that's dedicated to finding and containing individuals with paranormal or paranatural properties in order to protect society at large. I first heard about it while playing another game called There Came an Echo, because it's actually related to one of the game's more elusive achievements. You can check them out through the link in the description. And what you'll find there is a bunch of reports and articles and writings on events or objects that the Foundation is aware of or has contained, which is essentially what the Bureau in Control does. So in Control, you'll play as a woman named
Jesse Faden. I'm just visiting. I should have lied.
Oh shit! You're the new director.
who is searching for her brother, and she eventually finds out that the government may have a clue as to his whereabouts. So she tracks down the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Control, a fictitious agency that operates from a mysterious building called the Oldest House in New York. This building is definitely the star of the show, and I'm going to say that a lot, and if you've seen any of the trailers of the game, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The building is almost alive and shifts around, and it's fitting that the Bureau chose to operate from here because their primary goal is to study paranatural forces and protect the country from them. Soon after Jessie enters the building, she becomes the new director of the Bureau and discovers that the Bureau is under attack by an invading force called the Hiss. That's the gist of the setting. Basically, you move through the building, trying to stabilize the situation, looking for survivors, trying to find a solution. It's a new, weird experience, and from the setting, it's obvious that it's meant to have elements of a suspense thriller woven into it. But they just don't seem to nail that part of the formula because the veil of mystery is just completely flung to one side as soon as you start talking to someone. Remedy does this thing in Control where in almost every dialogue, the scene cuts over to Jessie's inner monologue.
Emily Pope. I don't know her, but I like her already. She's the opposite of the faceless agency I've blamed for what happened to me for so long. But I can't trust her yet. Or rather, the Bureau she's a part of. Yes. I can try. Do you know who I am? Oh, you know me. Say it.
You are Dylan Faden's sister.
He's talking in the third person. Always a good sign. Do you know who you are?
Now, after a while, I realized she isn't actually talking to herself. She's actually talking to this entity that lives inside her head and is guiding her through the oldest house.
Yeah, I see it. But what is it? I can feel it. It resonates. The things you show me, my friend.
But the problem is this method of exposition leaves nothing to the imagination. You never have to wonder what's going on in Jesse's head. I guess I just wanted more of that air of mystery that you feel when you're walking through the offices of the ground floor at the beginning, when you don't know really what's happening. But anyway, this is a game, right? So what's the shooting part like? When Jessie becomes the director, she gets a paranatural gun called the service weapon. This gun regenerates ammo and changes forms to give it different fire modes. The first default form is a pistol, and can I just stop here and say thank you. Thank you, Remedy, for making the default weapon actually good and a viable choice in many combat situations. The shooting in this game is really satisfying. The sounds of the guns, the visual feedback when you pull the trigger makes your actions feel impactful. Well, at least way more impactful than the pea shooter pistols we had in Borderlands 2. The other forms of the gun basically make it have behavior like a different gun. So a shotgun, or an SMG, or a rocket launcher, etc. I've seen other reviewers complaining that most of the weapon forms are essentially useless. Why would you ever equip the shotgun if you can just use your melee, they say. I don't think I can agree with them though. I found every weapon useful at some point or another, especially when returning to an area where you know the layout and have a good idea of which enemies you'll be facing. The best weapon for a situation, after all, is not always the one that kills the enemy the fastest. And like I said earlier, this is not a cover-based shooter. You can manually crouch behind cover, but this is really just for safely moving up on dangerous enemies like snipers. You're not supposed to be using it all the time. Generally in this game, movement is your best defense. And as soon as you stop moving, you start dying. You are meant to be aggressive, constantly moving, flanking, getting in the enemy's face, causing havoc. Enemies actually drop health pickups when they take damage. You aren't going to be collecting any of those if you're on the other side of the room. And then there's Jesse's powers, which are also central to the game's lore and where all the weird themes from the SCP really shine through. Throughout the oldest house, Jesse will find objects that have paranatural energies in them. The entire reason for the Bureau's existence is to contain and study these objects. Jesse can bind some of them to receive new powers, like a floppy disk that gives you the power of telekinesis. The interesting thing is that not all of them are on the critical path. You probably won't miss any of the powers, but you could if you don't explore a bit. Control actually feels a lot like a Metroidvania style game. And I'm not talking about the backtracking it makes you do. And yes, there will be quite a bit of that. I mean, you'll be going through an early level and you'll see a box in a difficult location. But with a little bit of janky effort, you get to it, and the reward that you find inside is meaningful to you at that stage in the game. Now, you do get the power to levitate eventually. And no, that's not a spoiler, it was in all the trailers. But if you were to go back and do all of those boxes the easy way by levitating up to them, the rewards you get at that stage just wouldn't be worth all of the backtracking effort at that point in the game. This game rewards you going in with an open mind, looking for secrets, and there are secrets to find. some of them opening up extra bits of gameplay that are honestly some of the best moments in the game. Example, this is one of the bosses you encounter while running through the story. He's actually just one of the normal enemy types, but stronger and with a name. The game does this more than once, and this is actually a major story point boss. But this is one of the bosses that you get to fight when doing a side mission.
The fuck is that?
It's making more clocks?
This is a ship's anchor that replicates other objects around it, and right now it's fixated on replicating a certain pendulum clock. If you didn't take the time to wander off the direct path to your goal, it's actually quite feasible that you would have completely missed this content. This is just one of the optional bosses. I do think that the setting of the game was somewhat underutilized though. I said before that the oldest house really is the star of the show here. You spend the game exploring an infinite building that is so much bigger than it seems to be, and that shifts itself around. And while you see it shifting in scripted sections, the building never actually shifts again after that, which is a shame considering how often you will be encouraged to revisit old areas. The game even tells you in the lore how much of a pain the building shifts are for the people working there.
Any luck finding the armory?
None. Looks like it got shifted. We have rangers checking each sector.
Fuck, whose side is the house on?
There's even this thing called the Atlas, which is an artifact that is housed in a certain portion of one of the sectors, which supposedly is linked in some way to the building shifts. I would have really liked to see the relative positions of areas in the building switch places every time you return to a sector, and even have certain secrets be only accessible when the building is in a certain configuration. Imagine if you were going through an old area that you know really well, like the executive sector, and you're going through central executive, past the offices and the rows of desks, expecting for the boardroom to be just around the corner, and then a building shift happens right then and there, and the doors move around, and you end up in the cafeteria, and you have to take a different door and double back to get into the boardroom, which is where you wanted to be. This would have made the time limits on the random alert missions much more meaningful, because you wouldn't immediately know what the best route to your objective is, and simply fast traveling to the closest control point just wouldn't be as reliable as it is now. Also, the dynamic building shifts would have opened up so many possibilities for some beautiful ray-traced shadow effects and lighting, which is a point I haven't touched on yet. This game really does a great job of showing what is practically possible in a game using ray tracing. The shadows and reflections add to the level of immersion without everything just becoming unrealistically shiny and mirror-like. I'll link to a video by Digital Foundry who did a stellar job of demonstrating what Remedy managed to achieve with this technology. They go into quite a bit of detail about each and every graphical preset, and they can explain it much better than I can. There's not much else for me to complain about here. The game is not very difficult, which I've also seen people complain about. And again, I don't think the intention was ever to create a hardcore shooter here, but rather to create an experience centered around exploration and intrigue. That being said, adding a few difficulty settings in a future patch would go a long way to making this a viable game for live streamers to use for challenge runs and speedruns. The facial animations are another obvious pain point. Now, I actually found that most of the animations were quite acceptable.
Congratulations on your appointment, Director Phaeton. I'm Helen Marshall, Head of Bureau Operations.
But there were a few characters that could have used a few extra hours of development. The problem is when literally the second person you speak to in the game looks like she's struggling to breathe while talking to you.
Don't worry, I love going over the basics. So objects of power are mundane objects that house paranatural energies and have developed a link to the astral plane and can thus be controlled, which is what differentiates them from altered items, which are still housings of paranatural forces, but are more volatile and cannot be bound in the peri-utilitarian sense. Got it?
First impressions really matter, especially when the story is the main tool for building suspense in a game like this. And speaking of story, I can't not mention the ending, or lack thereof. Control really didn't nail the ending. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but basically, the game builds you up with a couple of big reveals towards the end, explaining how the Bureau got compromised to begin with, and then it just ends. That's it. There isn't really a climax to the story. There isn't even an epic end boss fight with some kind of hiss overlord. There is an epic fight at the end, but it's the same kind of fight I talked about earlier, where they just throw a bunch of beefed up named versions of normal enemies at you. And then the story just ends. It's almost like the publishers ran out of time or money and they just had to cut the story right then and there in the most elegant way they could, and were unable to script the ending in the way they originally intended. Now, I don't believe this ending invalidates the story preceding it. I still think it's a good story. But just don't pick this game up expecting to have your Thanos snap moment at the end, because you'll be disappointed when it just doesn't arrive. So, have you played Control? What did you think? How many secrets and altered items did you find? Let me know down in the comments, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you know when the next video goes live.